Maria, you would introduce me, I suppose.
No, Sotiria.
Sotiria, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, boy. And then we will have a Q&A afterwards, right?
Mm-hmm. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Welcome to this ETUI webinar entitled Homoploutia, or why the traditional division between capitalists and laborers is less relevant today. My name is Sotiria Theodoropoulou. I'm the head of the research unit, European Economic, Employment and Social Policies at the ETUI, and I will be moderating this event today. Before I introduce today's topic and our speaker, one housekeeping remark. Please use the Q&A function of Zoom at the bottom of the screen for any questions you may have. So today's webinar is part of recent ETUI stream work, most notably our flagship publication, Benchmarking Working Europe 2020, and events, most notably our most recent biennial conference entitled A Blueprint for Equality, which was held last June in Brussels, both of which examined the question of inequality. During our conference, we sought to stimulate collective reflection and debate on what action should be taken to redress the growing inequalities that threaten social, economic, and human development. While in our Benchmarking Working Europe publication, we reviewed the many dimensions of the inequality problem in Europe, and we argued that inequality is not just incidental to a particular crisis, but rather a structural problem created by an economic model that for the past 3 decades has progressively redistributed less and less wealth to the bottom percentiles of society, while accumulating more and more at the top. It is our great pleasure then to welcome today Professor Branko Milanović, research professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and distinguished author on questions of income inequality at the national and global level. His research articles have appeared in prominent international academic journals, whereas his books have received several distinctions. His book, Global Inequality, published in 2016, has been translated into 16 languages. And his most recent book, Capitalism Alone, was published in 2019. In today's webinar, Professor Milanović will talk to us about one of the systemic features of what in this most recent book he calls the liberal meritocratic variety of capitalism, Homoploutia. That is the fact that the current ruling upper class in this variety of capitalism is drawing its income both from labor and capital. And what are the implications of this for generating but also mitigating income inequality? As I mentioned, we have planned some time for questions and answers after his talk. So, Professor Milanović, welcome. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Sotiria. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be virtually there. As you mentioned, what I'm going to talk today is a sort of a summary of one part of my recent book called Capitalism Alone, with the emphasis on homoploutia, which you already defined, and I will define it even more, as a combination of high incomes, both of labor and capital, received by the same people, which is, as you will see in a minute, it's something relatively new. We have not had this kind of a phenomena before. So let me simply start with the structure of the book. Of course, I'm not going to go through all these chapters, but I want to give people an idea what the book talks about. It does first in chapter 1, does the contours of the post-Cold War, which basically are sort of the key features there are 2. One is the rise of Asia, which was the factor behind the reduction in global inequality. That was something that my previous book dealt with. And the second feature is the quasi-total prevalence of capitalism as a mode of production in the world. I will not expand on that, but let me just say that rather than the obvious one that after 1990 and the fall of communism, capitalism and globalization were actually not that prevalent historically before, because they had to deal with other feudal modes of production before. As of course you know, slavery and serfdom were eliminated even in Central Europe only in the mid-19th century, in the US only in 1865, in Russia 1861, in Brazil 1878. So capitalism is a relatively recent phenomenon. And then I divided into two: liberal meritocratic capitalism, of which I will speak today, and political capitalism, where I use China. And the last two chapters are really maybe more philosophical and maybe about the interrelationship between capitalism and globalization. So let me focus on liberal and meritocratic capitalism. These two terms are not really chosen accidentally, liberal and meritocratic. They both come from John Rawls. He talks about liberal and meritocratic equality. Now, meritocratic equality is not what we often say meritocratic system. Meritocratic capitalism or meritocratic equality in Rawls is simply equality where there are no predetermined impediments to anybody reaching any position in society, legal impediments. For example, if you were in pre-revolutionary France or pre-revolutionary Russia, your class, nobility, would actually allow you to have special jobs, special positions, and your absence of that class would limit you. So in modern societies, we do not have that kind of a situation, with a very few exceptions. So that's what he meant by meritocratic. So don't take it as in a casual way. It is really sort of a technical term. Liberal means that there are two adjustments introduced, very, very important, which I would actually introduce as well. The first is limiting the ability to transmit across generations large amounts of inheritance. So it's basically taxation of inheritance. The second one, limiting the ability to transfer across generations large advantages in education, which means public education. So these are the two adjustments in terms of equality or greater social mobility that Rawls introduces in the definition of liberal equality, and which I use for liberal capitalism. So in that liberal capitalism, without reading all of this, I want to kind of highlight six what I call systemic inequalities. So the first one, in order to explain it, I have to take you a little bit to the past and to sort of show simplified version of classical capitalism. So what is a classical capitalism? If you read Ricardo, if you read Marx, you actually have a society divided into two classes. Even with Adam Smith, you will have the third one, or of course with Ricardo, you would have landlords. But for simplicity, we just put workers and capitalists. So now, how do they differ? First, they differ, as you can see here on the horizontal axis, because capitalists are richer than workers. Well, that's kind of obvious. But they differ also in two other ways. First, implicit assumption is that all capitalists are better off than any worker. So this is what is shown on this slide. You have income distribution of workers, and the richest worker ends with an income of X, but that income is lower than the income of the poorest capitalists. Obviously, it's a very sort of, how should I say, idealized picture. It's not like that in real life, but basically the major point is that not only one class is richer than the other, everybody who belongs to that class is richer than everybody who belongs in the other class. And second, very important distinction is that all capitalists receive 100% of their income from capital or from ownership of property, and workers receive 100% of their income from labor. Very simple. So this is really kind of a simplified classical structure. So then when you put it in income distribution, which is now when you have people ranked by total income on the horizontal axis and income level on the vertical axis, you do have inequality because labor income, as you can see, is not equally distributed. You have people from very low labor income. They could be really, I mean, obviously almost paupers, so people who have irregular jobs. And by the way, we have social tables for those periods in England or France and elsewhere, which actually show you the distribution in real life, in reality. And then you have of course, some inequality, but notice here too that the highest labor income, which is in red, ends, and then capital income, which actually I drew here exponentially to indicate that capital income is generally more unequally distributed than labor income, takes over. Okay, so this is kind of a simplified picture of income inequality in classical capitalism. How would it look in meritocratic capitalism? This is the capitalism that we have today. So this is a simplified version of what you would find in practically every country in Western Europe, or actually in Europe, or in the United States, or in Japan, and actually in many countries in the world, but we're talking about advanced countries here. Labor income starts obviously with some positive amount. It's increasing, but it does not actually, it has a distribution which is not extraordinarily unequal. And then how does capital income look like? First, it looks like in the bottom part of the income distribution, most people have zero capital income. So they have no property, they have no capital income. Well, then capital income starts kicking in. And as you can see, it increases very fast. And it is, again, as I was saying before, very unequally distributed among capital owners or people. And it's very unequally distributed because the top is very, very rich in terms of property income, and the bottom, it has no property income. So this is how the current structure is. And what you notice at the top, that actually people have both capital and labor income, but that the capital income tends among the richest classes, which are probably about 3 to 4% of the top, to be more important than labor income. So you notice here already the difference with classical capitalism. You notice here that actually some laborers are better off than people who have capital income, and there is more mixing of the positions between capitalists and workers. And moreover, as I will actually emphasize, same people will receive both capital and labor income. You will see that in a minute on real data. And then finally, when I speak of homoploutic capitalism, just to give you an idea what it is, homoploutic means, this is the Greek word, which I sort of made up with my Greek friends. But basically, the idea here is to say homo is the same and plutia wealth. So people have same compositional structural wealth. In other words, they are in the top. They are wealthy in terms of property, and they are wealthy in terms of human capital. So that's the idea, being wealthy in terms of property and human capital. Now, if you extend that homoploutic approach by saying, let's suppose the world where everybody has the same shares of labor and capital income. So you are very rich and you have, 30% of capital income and 70% of labor income. And I'm poor, but I have the same proportions. Then you would have something like that actually proportions do not change, but income levels change. So what is important to realize there, that even if inequality in the compositional structure is zero, everybody has same proportion of labor and capital, inequality in income can be very high. So inequality in income could be high because you have, as I said, 1,700,000 comes from labor, 300,000 comes from capital, and I have 170 comes from labor and 30 comes from capital. The gap is enormous, but the structure, compositional inequality is low. So this is something that I'm going to tease out in a moment. So let's go very quickly over 6 what I call systemic inequalities. Some of you will know, and then I'll focus on homoploutia. The first one is that we have had over the last 30 years a systemic and stable increase in the capital share. That means that actually if you take net value added, more of the net value added has belonged to the owners of capital than in the past. You see here, this is for the G7 countries. We have moved from about 32% to capital to about 39% to capital. This is essentially a change in favor of capital in the factorial distribution of income, which means it is a distribution between capital and labor. Now, that translates into higher interpersonal inequality because the source of income which is growing, which is capital, is more unequally distributed and it's actually more unequally distributed in a particular way that people who receive most of that are rich people. So in that sense, we have a translation or kind of quasi automatic translation from higher functional inequality, capital versus labor, into higher interpersonal inequality. And this is something very important to realize. If capital income were not so unequally distributed, the fact that there is more capital income than labor income is not a problem. The problem is that capital becomes more plentiful, capital income becomes larger, and that capital income is very unequally distributed. So that's why you have this transmission into interpersonal, high interpersonal inequality. To give you an idea, this is the most recent numbers from Luxembourg income study. You see here we have numbers up to 2020. And these are the Gini coefficients, which are measures of inequality, which in the extreme case go to 1. And when everybody has the same amount, it's 0. And they show you here the Gini for capital income and labor income. So I'll show you the US, and then you can look for the other countries and see basically the same story. In every case, the blue line, which is Gini coefficient of capital, is around 0.9. It's extremely high. It actually is equivalent to 90% of population having 0 capital income and 10% of population dividing the rest among themselves. And as you can see, whether you are, Norway, Germany, US, UK, and actually I've got a dozen of other countries, the story is always the same. Capital is much more unequally distributed. Notice that actually labor in some of these countries has become also much more unequally, labor income. For example, notice the increase obviously under Margaret Thatcher in the UK, very clearly shown in the red here in the 1990s. The same thing for the US, sort of continued increase between 1970s and almost 2010. And notice also for Norway, same story. So there is no Denmark, quote unquote, in this story. Denmark is like everybody else. The blue line is very high. The red line is relatively low and increasing. Notice also an interesting thing, which I actually don't know the origin of that, but you notice for Germany, a steady increase in inequality of capital distribution in the last 10 years. And likewise for the UK. At the same time, for the UK, the distribution of wage income is showing declines. So these declines are not small, it's the graph that actually had to put too many things there, but these declines are reasonably important. So another way to see it is actually US, which is a little bit more extreme than the others, but not totally different, is that 60% of income from property is received by the richest income decile. And notice the other deciles, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they all almost have no capital income. And that's the same thing for Germany. The bottom 30% have 0 capital income. So that's a very typical thing. Again, for the US, it's even more dramatic when you look at stocks, because capital income includes also imputed value of housing. But when you look at financial assets, you notice here that the top 10% of the wealth holders owns about 90% of stocks or financial assets. In other words, if you want to simplify, you can say that financially, the United States is owned by 10% of people. So that's kind of a bottom line. And that's not very different, as I said, in other countries. So let me just go then to homoploutia. Homoploutia could be defined many different ways. One way that I define it also in the paper that I did with 2 different authors is to look at what percentage of people who are in the top 10% by labor income would be also in the top 10% by capital income. And that works in reverse. What percentage of people who are in the top 10% of capital holders are in the top percent of labor holders? Now go back to what I said about classical capitalism. You have a classical capitalist. Let's suppose you have Rothschild or somebody very rich. So is this Rothschild, who is in the top of capital in the capital income distribution, being very rich and receiving lots of money from dividends and other things, is he going to have a high labor income? Well, it's a no-brainer. He's not going to have a high labor income. And if you read any book by Balzac or Jane Austen, you know that these people with high labor income, high capital incomes, including land, are not exactly working. They're not going to the office every day. So they would be in the distribution of labor, they will be at the bottom. they would have zero labor income and very high capital income. So that would be the classical capitalism. What you see here in this blue line for the United States, you see on the contrary, that there is an increasing share of people who are rich by capital, who are also rich in terms of labor. And this number shows you that now, 2020, about 30% of people who are richest capitalists are also the richest workers. And that's a dramatic change compared to the classical capitalism, where we had these two groups being very different. Now, notice the second line is Spain. That the homoploutia is less in Spain, but it's still increasing. And the third line is Mexico. So what do we see in the case of Mexico? We see the classical capitalism. There are actually few of the rich capitalists who are rich workers. Because they're sufficiently rich being capitalists, they're not going to go to start working in jobs as a lawyer or something else. They, stay and run their own enterprise. So that's why in the case of Mexico, you have 10%. And when you do that for all countries that we have in Luxembourg income study, I'm not going to go through all of them, but you might find countries that you're interested in. You, of course, see US, Italy, Netherlands, Finland, with very high homoploutia, over 25%. Of the richest capitalists are also richest workers. And if you go to the back, you see to the bottom, you see Mexico, Brazil, Hungary, Egypt, Russia, with low shares. Canada is also a low share. I don't know why, but it does show a low share. So these are countries of more classical capitalism that we had in mind. So when we have defined that, there are several questions that we have to ask. And the first one, how much of the increase in inequality is due to homoploutia? Can homoploutia help us classify and understand various capitalisms? And more speculative, does homoploutia make social mobility less and fight against inequality more difficult, or is it a dramatic improvement over classical capitalism? Let me just go with the third point first, and then I'll show you some graphs, and I think we'll stop there. Does it make social mobility less? That's quite possible, because what you can actually see there in homoploutia, you can see that the same families have the advantage of large capital income and property, which then also in the system where the education is private, gives huge advantage to their children to go to the best schools, to get actually the degrees which enable them to have high wages. And of course, it makes the next generation being homoploutic as well, because they draw from their parents through inheritance, draw wealth, and through ability to go to schools that enable them to get high-paying jobs, they have high human capital. On top of that, you can say they have connections and other things, social capital. So you can say, well, homoploutia may actually not be so good because it essentially creates a new elite. On the other hand, you can say, well, the cleavage which existed between capital owners and laborers is now much less, because we have same people who are both capitalists and workers, unlike in the past when we had either capitalists or workers, and the class structure was very clear, and there was a conflict between the classes. So you see, that's actually, I'm not going to pronounce which one I think is more relevant, but we have to be careful in discussing homoploutia, because it has certain positive aspects, but it has some elitistic aspects that may be negative. And how much is homoploutia? This is actually how much has it contributed to US inequality? This is work that I did with Jonathan Berman. This is the same story here as you have seen before, except that we have now used 3 different data sources, and they all agree about the increased homoploutia. They all come up with a number of 30%. They are different. I use the survey. This is from Survey of Consumer Finance, and from Luxembourg Income Study, which is based on current population survey in the US. And there is a third source as well. As you can see, they all agree about increasing homoploutia in the United States. And then the increasing homoploutia in the United States also means that there are people who are capital rich are no longer labor income poor. In other words, that I was saying before is that actually you have now many fewer very rich capitalists who are also with zero labor incomes. Actually, rich capitalists now have positive labor incomes because they participate in the labor market as a whole. And then finally, we find that actually Homoploutia accounts for about 1/5 of the increase in US inequality between 1985 and 2020. In other words, the effect of Homoploutia was even greater than the effect of increasing capital share. I mentioned before that one of the problems of inequality in liberal capitalism was the rising share of income coming from property and capital. On top of that, we have to include the effect of Homoploutia, meaning that the translation on transmission of that higher capital income is into the hands of people who are rich in terms of both capital and labor income. So I would maybe just show last slide, which then puts Homoploutia in a sort of a global perspective with, again, data from Luxembourg income study. And here, this is a complicated graph. We start from the very top over here, classical capitalism. So these are the countries that have high inequality, compositional inequality, and high income inequality. This is, as I said, complicated graph. I'll explain it later, but just bear with me for the last minute. It's just simply look at the countries that are in that circle. They're essentially Latin American countries. They are countries that have very high distinction between capital owners and laborers, and they have very high overall inequality. Go all the way down. So don't go into the red circle, just go into the blue one still. And you find there basically most of the West European and North American countries. You can see Canada, Australia, Ireland, Spain, US, Austria, Germany, and so on. And what is special there is that these countries are actually with less inequality in composition. So in other words, that split between capital and labor is less, and their inequality is much less. The interesting part, it was actually somewhat even surprising to us, is the position of the Scandinavian countries that are in terms of capital inequality fairly unequal, not very different from South American countries, but very equal in terms of the Gini of overall income. And the reason for that is an interesting one, is that many of people there, and it's very common, is to have private pension plans, which are the result of saving over a lifetime and which are treated obviously as a capital income. You have forced saving, and then after you retire, you get a return from your forced saving, which is essentially a return from property. And what was interesting, we have some kind of a, very bizarre kind of a pensioner capitalism that really is something that classical authors could not imagine. And it was actually driven, as I said, by the significant importance of forced saving and of the private pension plans. So these are the three kind of, types of capitalism. We have actually in our paper more. I can show you that later, but this is the basic story. And I think I've already probably gone over my time. So I think I should stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very stimulating talk. We already have some questions from participants. I read from the Q&A window. Philip Stepanovic from TUAC at the OECD asks, would you argue that capital income accumulation has spilled over to labor income, increasing inequality in the distribution of the latter? So rich people having access to better education, therefore better paid jobs in a post-purely rentier society, etc. Or is accumulation of income led to has accumulation of labor income led to a new wealthy class? Top decile labor income earners investing in assets of sorts from real estate to financial markets. This is one question. A second question from Seb Schmoller is, what are the implications of Homoploutia for the structure of the taxation system as a tool for redistribution? presumably the inheritance tax matters more and land and wealth taxes too. And a more technical question from Vasilis Monasteriotis from the London School of Economics. Does labor income include income from self-employment in your calculations?
Okay,
So
that's very good. Let me ask the last question. Actually, we have we have three different versions for self-employment income. In the version I think that I show you here, self-employment income is treated as labor income. In the other version, we split self-employment income into half. You know, the reason I have to explain, self-employment income in the countries that we have here is particularly important in Latin American countries. And we decided the preferred approach was to treat it as labor income because we believe, and we have seen some studies, that most of the self-employment income in sort of less developed countries is really labor income, and the capital part is relatively minor. However, in richer countries, like for example, the UK, where there was an increase in self-employment income over the last 20 or 30 years, the situation is different. But we didn't have enough information to treat different countries differently. So we have two versions. One is capital and labor are divided equally. So if you have $100 of self-employment income, we put 50 for labor, 50 for capital. And the second version is that we actually put 100% of your self-employment income as labor. So that's for the technical part. But it is indeed, I think, an important issue. And there is also another issue that I will not now discuss, but it's a treatment of very high incomes, which are labor income, but they come in form of shares, for example. So I'll leave that for later. Now, the answer to two questions, I'm going sort of backwards. The answer to the question of taxation is that I don't think that it makes really taxation very difficult. If you really tax inheritance, then you would actually tax, obviously, income, wealth. Or if you take a wealth tax every year, you would tax wealth. Labor income is taxed obviously annually differently. You cannot tax it at the end of somebody's life. So I don't think it makes, to me, it doesn't make a huge difference in taxation. Maybe you would like to have higher tax on capital than on labor, maybe not. But I don't think it makes the difference compared to the alternative. Let's suppose that with less homoploutia. But maybe I'm wrong on that. On the first question, we don't have longitudinal data, but there are two possibilities that we sort of commonsensically can imagine. One is that you have people who inherit quite a lot or significant amount of wealth, and then they actually, through their intelligence or connections or luck, go to good schools, get high labor income, and then combine high labor income with what they have inherited. Okay, so they become homoploutic. The other possibility is that you might come with relatively little inheritance, but then you go actually again have very high labor income. As we know, for example, people like CEOs and the others who make millions of dollars, you invest, you make returns on that, and then at around maybe 40, you become homoploutic because you're both rich in labor and capital. We don't know which one of these two channels is more common, simply because we don't have long-term data to tell that. But it is, I think, an interesting question.
Thank you. Some more questions coming from our audience. Paul Lim asks, what about the countries outside the three circles? I believe that he refers, yes, to this slide that you had recently. Jerry Mitchell asks, what do your findings mean for the Labour Manifesto in the UK? Georgia Kaplanoglou asks, in Greece and other countries, salary incomes might appear as income from dividends for tax reasons because dividends are taxed less. High salary employees are given company shares. Would this impact on how statistics appear?
Okay, let me go again from the last one. It's a very tricky issue. Let's suppose you're a worker, which means that you know, when we say worker, it is somebody who is paid for his labor. So either physical presence, obviously, or now, you know, online presence, but labor activity is involved. So you suppose you're a CEO, and you actually, as many of them, or top management, or as the lady said in Greece, that actually people with high wages get shares in order to pay less taxes. That share is the value of that share that you receive is, strictly speaking, that's how we treat it in Luxembourg income study, is labor income. We should not be confused by the fact that it is a share. It's the labor income in the same sense that in some countries you're being paid in kind. Let's suppose you're being paid in food for your labor. It's the same, whether you're paid in food for your labor or you are paid in shares for your labor. It's still labor income when you receive it. When that share, however, starts producing dividends, then it becomes capital income. So in period 2, you have, I suppose, invested that share, and that share gives you X amount of dividend. This is capital income, but it's not a capital income at the time when you have received. So I just want to be clear about that, because many people are not clear, and I think you have them to sort of clarify when you point out that we treat fringe benefits and benefits in kind, which are linked with work, as labor income. You had situations, for example, in poor countries that somebody, or historically, like in Europe in the 19th century, people were paid in food, drinks, and then they would get a little bit of cash. But when we take the wage, we actually impute, since I work historical data, we impute value of food and drinks to the wage. So it's not different from receiving a share. So I think that's explanation for this question. Could you just please remind me the other two?
Yes. What would your findings mean for Labour Manifesto in the UK? And what about the countries outside the three circles?
Yeah. Okay, the second one is easy, or the first, whatever. I really don't know anything about Labour Manifesto, so I cannot say anything. The previous, what are the countries that are out? Yeah, well, that implies, for example, look at the US. US and Israel, they're very similar. They're out because they're a little bit of an extreme case of European countries, in the sense they have greater inequality, compositional inequality, and greater inequality in the Gini coefficient. Notice the Gini coefficient, which is on the vertical axis, for the US is about more than 45. It's between 45 and 50, and that's pretty high compared to the sort of European countries that are about 0.4. So that's why US and Israel are outside. Now, notice one country which is very interesting, actually rather two countries that are very interesting, Taiwan and Slovakia. What was very interesting, they are closest to classless societies. Actually, they have what is very interesting, relatively low compositional inequality, which means that more or less people receive equal shares from capital and labor. And secondly, the level of inequality in Taiwan and Slovakia is relatively low. It is not well known, for example, that Taiwan has significantly lower inequality than China. Taiwan also has a lower compositional inequality. China has a pretty high compositional inequality in the sense that rich people in China receive also predominantly, I don't have the slides here, but Chinese distribution of capital income is not very different from the US distribution of capital income. So these are the countries outside of the circles, and as you can see on this graph, they are kind of closest to a classless society. Classless society would be, by this definition, society where everybody has the same share of capital and labor, and overall inequality is very low. So we have a Gini coefficient, let's say about of 0.25, and everybody, you're a rich guy, I'm middle class, and another person is a poor, we have same shares of labor and capital income. So that would be the classless society in this particular definition.
Thank you. A few more questions, if that's okay with you. Gudrun Steinacker, I hope I pronounced the name correctly, asks, a lot of capital is nowadays acquired by illegal activities, crime, kleptocracy, corruption, tax evasion, money laundering. But these people are then also actors in the market. How does this group fit in your model? What are the key implications of your analysis for policy, including tax policy, asks Sanja Terlevich. And Ion from SEER asks, what are the differences between ex-communist countries like Romania, Hungary, Poland, and Nordic countries, please?
Okay, well, let me, I just wanted to show something else. Okay, again, the last one, I'm not sure about really you cannot say the post-communist countries as such represent a group. And I'm actually more and more inclined to that we should reject that classification because there are differences. Look at the, for example, here, Poland is very similar with and Romania and Czech Republic are similar with countries like Finland, Norway, Denmark, in the sense that they have fairly high inequality in composition, but they don't have high overall Gini. Slovenia and Slovakia are countries with very low Gini. So, you know, they are, you know, I don't think they're like a sort of a group as such. So that's what I think about them. What was sorry, what was the previous one? Well, about taxation policy. I have some here recommendations at the end. Let me just see. They don't deal with taxation policy per se, but they're dealing with generally with evolution, which is actually driven by increasing share of capital. And I actually think that basically we have to go to what essentially Rawls advocated and which I mentioned in the beginning, is that we have to have increased taxation at the top, both from the flow, which essentially means from the rising capital income that is received from capital, and on the stock, which means wealth. And much greater emphasis than in the past, which is actually now sort of happening in Europe as well, on public education, free public education, because this is an extremely important way of equalizing chances. Now, I know this seems trivial, but I want to point out the following thing, which I think is not that trivial. When you have very expensive education, which is private education, it's not only that only the rich people can send their kids there. So that's one problem. There is a secondary problem, which is much less sort of discussed. It is when you have expensive education, for this education to produce a return, because nobody is going to take expensive education and then basically, if this gives him or her nothing in terms of higher salary. For that education to produce a return, you have to have high wage inequality. Because if I spend $100,000 going to a U.S. school, I'm not going to be happy with the job that pays me $40,000, and I would not be able to recoup the costs. So what you have in expensive education, you have a direct link, direct invitation for high wage inequality. It cannot be otherwise because the system cannot exist. If there was no high wage inequality, nobody would go to an expensive school. It was just totally silly. You would have a negative return. So that's what I think is important to realize, why expensive public education is really anti-equality. First, because the selection into debt is essentially monopolized by the rich who can afford. And secondly, because it requires high wage inequality. And that's why I think Rawls was entirely right when he was emphasizing the second element of education that is crucial. In other words, that it should be accessible to everybody. But when it comes to taxation, really, I don't have there anything new and special. I believe that capital incomes should be taxed either at the same rate, or maybe there are some arguments to be at a higher rate, but and that the top incomes, particularly in the US, now there is an increase in taxation of top incomes, but they are still, I think, under taxed. So that's all that I think. Actually, I think sometimes that we should not really focus only on taxation, but we should focus also on other things, including education that I mentioned, including, for example, the public financing of political campaigns and things like that, and not just the tax, which sometimes gets people sort of angry. Is there I think, did I answer all questions, or there is one left still?
There was one more on a lot of capital being nowadays acquired by illegal activities. How does this group fit in your model? These people are also actors in the market.
You know, the data that I've shown you here, this is from Luxembourg Income Study. Now, Luxembourg Income Study harmonizes the data that they obtain from countries from household surveys. Actually, Europe is very consistent. They have SILK, and SILK survey, which is done every year for more than 30 countries and has the same methodology, produces the data annually. But of course, for many other countries, they do it according to from their own surveys. Methodologically, they're all the same because they follow the UN guidelines. It's a system of national accounts. So people cannot just invent their own, sometimes people do invent, but this is wrong. They invent their definition of income, whatever, but normally they don't. Now, the question is actually what happens with people who have acquired income or wealth illegally? Well, they are not treated from anywhere differently from anybody else, and when you have a survey, you don't ask, did you get this wage income because you were, I don't know, cheating somebody, or you got this wage income in a legal way? We are totally indifferent to that, and we are not supposed to ask that. There is actually even a category which actually includes, but it's in the consumption side, includes, for example, drugs and other things, but not too many people report on that. However, so in principle, it's the same. As I said, we are totally indifferent as to the legality of income that is being received. But it is reasonable to assume that people who actually have large illegal incomes are not going to report that, or people who are extremely rich and they have become rich through, stealing or bribery, they're not going to participate in service. So my guess is that we are probably underestimating these people. But this is a guess. We don't know, but I have to emphasize that the surveys are anonymous. There is absolutely no information who that person is, and that in principle, they should actually report all income regardless of the way that it was acquired. But they probably don't. And we know, for example, capital income is underestimated. All that I've shown you, capital income is underestimated in some cases by 50%. At the top.
Thank you. One more question for clarification by Luca Zanotta in Milan. Would you please say a few more words why the formation of this elite would reduce the class bias distinction? It appears to him as if an increase of a class-based distinction instead.
It may be a sort of how should I say, terminological issue, but I see class distinction as sort of in Marxist terms, labor versus capital, because the modes by which you acquire income through ownership and acquire income through labor power are different. And I would see this distinction in Homoploutia more as the formation of an elite which is rich in, as I was saying before, in terms of wealth, and is rich in terms of its human ability. And so I would see that as a danger of elite formation, that on top of that, because they are pretty good in their sort of education and knowledge and so on, that the elite can also be, I think, actually very self-conscious and believe that actually they deserve to be where they are. So I would really see it more as an elite and less as a class structure, simply because they have incomes from both labor and capital. But this is because my class definition is really a Marxist class definition, or Ricardian if you prefer it.
Thank you. So as we are approaching to the end of the webinar, I would like to ask you two final questions, zooming out a little bit towards the bigger picture. So the first is, in your book, when you analyze the variety of liberal meritocratic capitalism, you take the US as the ideal type. So can we say that the differences with European countries are differences of degree? So in principle, we have the same 6 characteristics that you list, of which Homoploutia is an important one, but to a lesser extent. So would you expect that Europe has similar problems as implied by your analysis of the US liberal meritocratic capitalism? And the second question is, from what I understand, investment in education so that the cost is reduced, also for those in the lower ends of the income distribution, is an important way of mitigating some of the characteristics of this liberal meritocratic capitalism. However, even before we had the war in Ukraine, where many countries started rethinking about their spending on defense, there were concerns that more spending on healthcare might come at the expense of public spending on education. So how do you see the prospects of tackling these aspects, these systemic factors leading to inequality under the current context, the current circumstances?
Okay, on the first question, obviously the US is different from continental European countries. Even in this slide, you see that US is not in that circle where practically most of the continental countries, other than the Nordic, are. But when, I work with global data generally. And when you work with global data, you just simply see that the US is in some ways a more extreme case of what you see in the rest of advanced capitalist countries in Europe. I know that people who work, and actually I think it's a kind of a, job determined, people who have worked for 30 years with a variety of capitalism, they always tend to, of course, take 20 countries that they work on, divide them, and of course they emphasize the distinction between the United States and Europe. But unfortunately, that literature, in my opinion, has stagnated. It has not moved to other parts of the world. It has not moved, like, do you have in varieties of capitalism discussion of South Africa? No. Do you have discussion of Indonesia? No. Do you have discussion of Argentina? No. So they have actually, unfortunately, been for 30 years discussing 20 countries. And then within that, of course, US is in kind of special case. But if you were to bring others, as I do here in the graph, you notice that the US is just a little bit more extreme, more sharp in certain features than the rest of advanced capitalist countries. It's more unequal, but it's not fundamentally different. So that's what I think actually for the US. Now, when it comes to the new developments, well, there is really nothing to say now, because first we don't know how this war will end or whether we will be alive. So there is not much to say. But then we had this unfortunate medical crisis. And then we have the China-US trade tension. So we are basically in a very difficult position. But talking of COVID, let me show you one thing which is not known, is that US had and several other countries like Brazil, for example, had a decline in this red line, which is disposable income inequality in 2020. And they had a decline, which probably also many West European countries as well, because of large government spending. Now, notice that actually it is a significant decline in 2020, whereas market income inequality, which is in blue, went up. But I mean, the irony, I tweeted that yesterday because I just did this graph yesterday. The irony is that actually Trump left with the United States with a disposable income inequality, which is the lowest in 28 years. And that happened because of the CARES Act and some 20% of GDP of transfers. So that's what happened during COVID. But that was 1 year. The transfers will not continue, did not continue in 2021, not continue in 2022. But now we have other issues. And I think, unfortunately, the increased military spending would certainly detract resources from education, housing, infrastructure, you name it. I think it's a disaster, but you know, I cannot do anything about this.
Thank you very much. We have reached the end of this webinar, so I would like to thank again Professor Milanović for making the effort to join us virtually from New York for this very interesting presentation, and all our participants from near and far. Thank you all, and see you in one of the ETUI's next events. And Professor Milanović, I hope next time you will be able to make it in person in one of our events.
Thank you very much. I would love to do it. Thank you again for the invitation, and thank you for listening. If you need the slides or anything else, just let me know.
Yes, that would be great. In fact, we received requests for that. Thank you very much.
I'll send you some. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.